We'd like to welcome everyone to our lecture today. It's the fifth in our series on social protection that BRED IGC is putting on, and we're very pleased to welcome Karen Macro, Chaired Professor at Paris School of Economics, and John Maluccio, Professor of Economics at Middlebury College, who will be sharing from their vast experience and research on measuring the long-run impact of cash transfers. We've built up over the past few weeks um, on social protection, the form of transfers, cash, in-kind vouchers. And so we're taking it one step further today on long-run impacts. And so we are really excited for that and are grateful for both John and Karen for their time and a willingness to share it with us, their expertise. Just quickly before we begin, a few housekeeping things. If you are interested in being a live participant, where you can have your video on and ask live questions in the Q&A, if you would raise your hand now, we'll select 20 or so people at random. And as a reminder, this recording will be put up on the IGC website after today, and you can view all past lectures as well there if you missed one. And on that note, we are doing a certification of attendance, which has a minimum of 10 out of 12 lectures. So we encourage you to continue to attend throughout the next few weeks through to the end of the course. And we have some really exciting things coming up. So thank you. And I'll turn it over now to John and Karen.
Wonderful. Thanks, Caleb, and welcome everybody. The way we're going to do the lecture part of this is I'll present and John are going to keep on track of the Q&A. So feel free to post any questions you have in the Q&A. Some of them John will be able to answer in writing. Some of them, at some point we can also obviously stop during the lecture. And those of you who will be selected as live participants, obviously, raise your hand at that point we try to do this as interactive as possible, and obviously we'll also have the questions at the end, which I'm sure you are now familiar with since you've been doing this a few times already. Just making, I think the panelists are there. Great, most of them. Excellent. So I think with that we can get started. So what we'll do today is talk about sharing about kind of insights we've gained both in joint work and some work kind of that other people have done on trying to get a hand of how do we measure the long-term impact of cash transfer. So you in the previous weeks have kind of talked about the different types of cash transfers and are aware that there is a very large literature on the short-term impacts of cash transfers and different forms and the different trade-offs that exist. Ultimately, a lot of the reasons why cash transfers exist is because there is kind of a long-term goal underlying a lot of social protection more general. And that's not just true for cash transfers. And so an empirical agenda, really an empirical agenda around, okay, how do we measure those, kind of what are the challenges, etc. So just as way of introduction, this is kind of coming back to the last few weeks. You might know that there is a lot of cash transfers all over the world, both conditional and unconditional. So I'll use the UCT and CCT abbreviations for that. They've been expanding widely worldwide for more than 25 years. And indeed, it's the original conditional cash transfers in Latin America that started at the same time in 1997 in Mexico and in Brazil. The Mexico one is kind of the example of a social policy innovation that was not just kind of based on sound economic kind of thinking and theory in its design, but then also built in from the start a rigorous randomized control trial on a relatively large set of villages in Mexico, evidence which then helped to make the argument for sustaining the program over a 20-year period, scaling it nationally in Mexico, but also scaling it globally. And so we're going to come back to this Mexico program at the end. But or kind of towards the end, in addition to those conditional cash transfer programs that have scaled globally, there is also an increasingly number of unconditional cash transfers, as you've heard the last few weeks. A lot of those are in Sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of those are either targeted to specific populations for either for kind of vulnerable population or through NGOs. Kind of national programs, government programs for vulnerable population or NGOs. And so there too, there is a question about, is there, once these transfers have been received, is there reasons to believe that this solves a problem on the longer term? And so there is both types of transfers have a goal of short-term poverty alleviation, but also of kind of long-term mobility through slightly different mechanisms. We'll come back to the mechanisms in a second. But kind of basically speaking, if we think of human capital, so the conditional cash transfer programs are typically conditional on investments in human capital, in education and health, with the specific idea that on the long term, that human capital will help break the intergenerational transmission of poverty. And so an open question, is whether they actually do that. And we'll come back to why it's an open question. But also for kind of the productive investments that typically are envisioned with the unconditional cash transfers, are there multiple returns to those investments or not? And so we kind of need to think of that long-term question. We need to think through the different channels that these types of programs, both types of programs, can have impacts on the long term. Because if once we kind of understand the theory of change, have had thought to the theory of change, we can then think through, okay, what are we gonna measure, and how, at which point do we measure, and how are we going to do this? Okay, so first focusing on the parts the investments in human capital. And so note, of course, that the unconditional cash transfers can also lead to investments in human capital. The short-term evidence shows that they are somewhat less likely to do that than the conditional cash transfer programs. But in both cases, that can happen. So once you have the gains in human capital, so imagine you have a program for which there is short-term evidence of gains in human capital, how can we think about whether that will have an impact on the long term? And again, the reason we need to answer that question is because ultimately, if governments are going to be investing in these type of programs, there are, like any other kind of investment, you want to think through the cost effectiveness of of those programming. And in this case, the return, the social returns of the program will come on the long term, right? So the kind of and so that's why it's important to have kind of the evidence on the long term. Even if one can say, well, the easy thing to say is, well, gains in human capital are important in their own right, and that's probably true. A separate question is whether, in addition to kind of caring about education and health for its own purpose, is it also leading to better outcomes kind of later in life? The first reason that may be the case is because the obvious one, in a certain way, is returns to human capital. That with better education, more education and health, you may be able to lead more productive and more enjoyable lives. In addition, these initial investments in human capital through self-productivity or dynamic complementarities potentially get amplified, right? So either because, like in the Hackman kind of wording, skills beget skills. Once you have an initial set of skills, kind of the additional gains in skills can be more productive, or kind of the different skills may be complementary. So, for instance, I may have developed early childhood nutrition or stimulation type of programs may affect brain development, and then formal education kind of can be complementary to that type of investment. Okay. Now, so in theory, there's reasons to believe that these type of returns are there, but then if we think in practice, it's not obvious that they will always be there, right? So first of all, it could, and that's kind of what's useful to think about. Okay, what do we want to think about when we think of the long term? So why may they not always be there is because partly it's going to presumably depend on the nature and the magnitude of the human capital gains, right? So if we think of the conditional cash transfers, that's a relatively wide types of human capital gains, human capital that can be affected, whether it's years of schooling versus learning in schools, a big debate, even just on that, whether it's cognition, brain development versus more socio-emotional skills. the nutritional status that may have its own return, of course, the health, etc. And so different pathways are going to affect long-term returns depending on the type of human capital gain. In addition, there is in kind of a big literature and an interest in thinking about, well, does the timing of the intervention matter? And so again, back to Heckman, where kind of the idea of that there may be particularly sensitive or even critical ages for investment in early childhood, meaning that if you then, again, think on the long term, you may want to think about, did this intervention happen at one of these sensitive or critical ages? People that benefited from those interventions may subsequently still be very vulnerable to exogenous shocks, whether that's, climate shocks, whether that's pandemics, whether that's macro shocks, you name it, and therefore potentially have limited return to the human capital, or potentially even higher return if the human capital helps them deal with the shock. So again, kind of different types of scenarios possible. There may be constraints to subsequent human capital investment, right? So for instance, nutrition health early in life, may help brain development, but then if the school system is very much not performing and kids are not learning anything in school because of the way that the school system is structured, that is going to lead to a different result than in a country where the school system is more functional. There may be other constraints limiting the returns to human capital, in think of labor market imperfections, etc. And then finally, once you have these national programs, and typically in the context of broader social protection and human capital policies of governments, it could be that people are gaining more human capital, but in a context, or the poor in particular that tend to be targeted, may be gaining human capital, but in a context where many other people are also getting more education and better health. And so how that is going to play out in the labor market in terms of capital is an open question. So the reason kind of going through this kind of, many different types of conditions is to kind of make the point to say, well, ex ante, it's not actually obvious if there is returns to human capital and under, in which type of settings for which kind of children or households and which settings. So hence it's an empirical question. But also hence we need to think about these different channels once we both analyze the research that has been done on it and think about new research in this space. Further complicating things is that many of these factors aren't fixed at time zero. So you may, in the Mexican government designed this initial program in 1997, the world today obviously looks very, very different than in 1997. Some of which that the Mexican government may have anticipated, a lot of it they probably didn't. And so again, if we want to think of the long-term gains, it's the returns that those gains are for the world today that may not have been anticipated at time zero. And in addition to that, in addition to the fact that time changes, individuals also move across space. And so while they may have been targeted in particularly marginalized areas, they can move subsequently to areas where some of these factors play differently. And again, we're going to need to take that into account, both in terms of how we design the research and how we interpret the research and think about its policy implications. That's on kind of the returns to human capital side. Now, of course, the of cash transfers also can work in different ways towards long-term investments. The most obvious one is because they may relax constraints to other types of investments through liquidity or otherwise. And so more general, there's a question is like, do these interventions permanently relax prior constraints to investment, whether that's intentional or not? So a couple of examples. So liquidity constraints is the obvious one, right? So cash transfer solve directly liquidity constraints. That's very obvious. Because the way people use that liquidity depends both on the conditions to a certain extent, but also many of these other external factors. The short-term literature does show that very often we see change in asset accumulation. So people use part of the transfers to get physical assets to make investments, and those then productive investments can have long-term returns. That's one way that you can have kind of long-term returns from the cash itself if you want to, and that's going to work, potentially differently for the different types of transfers. The other one is if they are regular transfers, is through consumption smoothing, because in most of these programs are implemented in areas where the insurance markets are very imperfect too. The regular flow of cash transfers can then help to smooth that and basically provide insurance. Yeah, John, come in, please.
And just a brief comment. Some participants are asking if you might be able to just slow down slightly your elocution. Thank you.
Of course. Anything else that came up? No, okay, great. I will talk slower. The best way of making me talk slower is by interrupting me. So that's on the panelists. Okay. Okay, so productive investments, so the cash itself can lead to investments that are that have direct productive returns, as opposed to the human capital where the return is going to come, after 20 or 30 years. Through the liquidity constraints, through the consumption smoothing, but also through the fact that these programs tend to, or not tend to, sometimes do, and the literature has shown this, change the way households themselves invest in their human capital or their productive investment. So other than solving the liquidity constraint, either because the programs also relax information constraints, so typically that would be the case for conditional cash transfer programs. The CCTs typically come with relatively heavy social marketing about the importance to invest, for instance, in education, in nutrition, also the type of nutrition, etc., and potentially change people's beliefs about the returns to that type of investments, right? So very often there is a purposeful information component integrated in this program. And why is that? Is because and again, the short-term literature has shown this, is so that households then, use not just the cash as any cash, but use it purposely to invest, to increase certain types of investments versus others. That's one way that then, of course, the impacts could be kind of amplified on the longer term, and potentially extended also to younger generations. The other one is because many of the programs, again, not all of them, but many, are targeting to many households at once, either because, by design, there's geographical targeting, and I think this, you'll talk about targeting next week. Or just because by nature poverty tends to be concentrated in certain areas, and so that then can change the social equilibrium, and through that reinforce changes in behavior of households. Or many of the programs also purposely target women, as I think you saw last week. And so with the idea of shifting intra-household equilibriums in terms of bargaining power, which also potentially could be maintained even if cash transfers, when they end. And so there's a number of different ways that these programs can relax kind of prior constraints to investments at the household level, on the medium and potentially on the long term, and through that affect the long-term outcomes. Now, as I think that other lecturers have already been highlighting, we have good reasons to believe, and in fact, we should kind of think from the start that the way these different factors will play are going to be very different in different contexts, and of course also depending on the particular design of an intervention. And so there is kind of going to be heterogeneity in kind of by space and by type of intervention, but also at the household level. Different households, typically households are heterogeneous pretty much anywhere we go, and so the way that the household level characteristics, constraints, etc., will interact with some of these theories of change, we should expect them to differ. And so as a result, we actually should expect heterogeneity, like we always do also on the short term when we think of interventions. But of course, if you think on the long term, so if you think, let's say, a period of 20 years, heterogeneity may well get amplified because there is a much longer time for that heterogeneity to play out, or potentially even could be important on the short term and then lead to some convergence on the long term. So overall, we can imagine many different pathways towards long-term impacts. And from a social science perspective, to understand this kind of complex puzzle, what we would love to do is to say, okay, I'm able to follow every treatment and control household at every point in time over a very long period of time, because then I could map the pathway and I could understand at which point these different factors play. Now, typically, of course, that's not the type of data we have. And so what kind of most of this lecture is going to be about is thinking about how do we address these kind of questions, given that our data by nature is going to be imperfect, and think about what is it that we can and cannot answer about this complex theory of change. Now, I think the first kind of thing that I want you to take away of this is that given how complex this is, and given that we should expect heterogeneity from the start, but also given that kind of we don't have the perfect data, there is not one study that can provide all the answers. No, that's true in everything we do in economics, of course, definitely in applied economics, but it's arguably even more true for this topic, given there is just much more time for many different kind of pathways to be developed. On the one hand, and because of the methodological challenges that are directly related to that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on those methodological challenges and how to address them. So this is going to be focused mostly on kind of more on the method side of things, with the specific goal that this is kind of useful, but hopefully for those of you who are thinking of this type of research, or who are thinking about kind of in your context and for the type of questions you're interested in, that this is useful. So of course, this lecture is focused on cash transfer in the context of social protection. I think these methodological challenges for long-term impacts are true pretty much for any type of intervention you can think of, and so there is some broader relevance there too. We're gonna kind of talk about the challenges first in a generic way, if you want to, and about potential ways of addressing them. And then I'm gonna talk through 3 different studies that in which we use different methods to tackle some of the challenges. Again, no particular study can tackle all of them by their very nature. And I'm going to also point out as a result, some of the constraints, if you want to, the weaknesses of each of those studies, to actually illustrate that point that there is not one answer here. And then after doing that, I'll come back to the more kind of what do we know about the evidence more globally to date, specifically, because by nature of the question, this is the long-term impacts of cash transfers is something we should be expected to learn much more about in the next, say, 10 years than we already know now, because we know we'll have many more cash transfers that have happened sufficient long time in the past so that we can think of the long term. And so again, for the PhD students among you, kind of hoping that this is useful also in that sense, kind of pointing out, okay, what do we know, but also, what we really not know yet. And so that's going to be towards the end, kind of the discussion on open questions. In all of this, I'm going to be throwing on work on conditional cash transfer programs that, because these programs started in Latin America, the evidence to date on the long term is mostly from Latin America, although there's some from Asia. And so that the focus will be on that. Again, that's keep that in mind, because in terms of, again, the relevance for other contexts, in terms of the actual lessons learned, they may be different. I think the methodological challenges, of course, are quite similar in different contexts. And then on the other hand, so we will complement that with work on unconditional cash transfers in sub-Saharan Africa, where the focus is more on this question on the productive investment and the multiplier effects those programs may have. Before I continue, any question to date? No. Okay. So let's kind of dig into the challenges. And so a lot of this, we'll start with with the most obvious one. I'm not sure it's the most important one, but it's definitely the most obvious one, which is that once we think of kind of trying to figure out impacts on the long term, selection into any type of database that we will use to, or that we gather to analyze the long-term impacts is going to be a first order concern. Right? So what we want to do is similar than what we want to do for short-term evaluations of programs. We have a population of interest at time zero, so before the program starts, that is representative of a treatment and a control group that we have identified. And we would want to know in a certain way what happens with this population, this representative population, 5, 10, 20 years later. The big challenge is that people move. And so we can't just go back. We can't kind of do what we do before for short-term evaluation, saying, okay, let's say I do an intervention. I do a lot of work in agriculture. So if I do an extension intervention with farmers in villages, I can go 1 year and I can go back a year or 2 years later. And most of these farmers will still be there because they're established households. And so any kind of concern about selection and attrition is going to be relatively limited. When we talk about long-term impacts, that's just never the case, because no matter where we are, we should expect over long periods of time people to move. Of course, that's particularly the case if we are talking about young people. So it's particularly the case if we think about like the long-term returns to the human capital types of investment that the cash transfers may trigger. Okay? We can't just assume this away or ignore it. And why? Is because in fact, we expect people to move. We expect that if we invest in human capital, if households invest in human capital with the help of the cash transfers programs, that the returns to their human capital are not necessarily in the same place than it would have been if they didn't have the human capital. And so we in fact expect them to move. Indeed, we have a whole literature on kind of on structural transformation and the rural agricultural productivity gap, suggesting that people with higher human capital move out of rural areas into urban areas, for instance. So we know that's why we can't assume this away. It's like, our theory tells us that they should move. What that means for us as researchers, like, how do we deal with that? How do we come up with a strategy that deals with that? Apart from geographical moves, which is part of the issue, it's also true that cash transfers and the theory of change that I outlined before is likely to affect trajectories more generally. So not just geographically, but for instance, the speed in which you progress through school, the moment you enter the job market, the choice, the ages of marriage, etc., are all potentially affected by the interventions. And so they will again differ between treatment, or we should expect them to potentially differ between treatment and control, and potentially also between different people in the treatment and in the control. So that complicates things, because what we want to do is compare treatment and control groups that are comparable. But if you get this selection happening for reasons that that theory tells us should be happening in a certain way, we will have, if we don't pay attention, we'll have two groups that are not actually comparable. So the thing I can do with my agricultural projects is just going back to the same villages and seeing who's there and interview them is not going to work, because the ones that are left in the village are not going to be comparable. So that's the likelihood that the treatment and control groups are comparable is low. So that's an internal validity concern, clearly, because the whole reason I had my initial design was to address this. In addition, there is going to be an external validity concern, because even if you're in the unlikely case that, or the likely case depending on the design, that the people that are left have comparable baseline characteristics, it's still true that some have left. And the people that have left may be those for whom the impacts are positive, or for that matter negative. And so if we don't know what happens with the people that left, even if those that stayed are similar, we have a big external validity constraint. At best, we can conclude something about the impacts for the people that stayed, but the impacts for the people that stay are not particularly policy relevant, nor necessarily particularly interesting. And so both for both internal and external validity, this is a problem we need to address. So apart from people moving and being on different trajectories, there is other types of selection concern that will enter. Apart from attrition, in one kind of particular case, but again a very frequent one observed in the literature, is kind of when you use administrative data to look at long-term impacts. This is a relatively frequent strategy. For instance, people using data on test scores at the end of high school, or just test scores at any point, for that matter, during the schooling cycle. In those countries where you link national identifier to school records and to test scores, or countries where you can use national identifiers to link to, let's say, social security numbers, or health insurance, or whatever it is that can be linked. That's more likely to be the case in high middle income countries as than in low income countries, but it's increasingly the case that this can be done in many countries. Now, the data is not necessarily complete in those administrative databases. Indeed, if I take the obvious case, if I take the high school graduation exams, well, not everybody graduates from high school. And so the children that haven't graduated won't be in that database. So incomplete administrative data is a concern. The other reason that it's a concern is that even if there is national identifiers, often when you do the merge, you lose people. There is kind of national identifier, there's mistakes in the data. And so you may not be able to merge people. And then again, those are probably not random people, potentially causing concerns. And then finally, the hardest one, arguably, because it's something we can't do anything about in the sense of trying to find complement data, is interventions can affect fertility and mortality. And so if the transfers directly affect the population, that can be observed. I mean, if some people unfortunately have passed away and others didn't, the ones that have passed away, I can't survey anymore. I don't have any administrative data on them anymore. I just know that they've passed away. And so that's going to lead to a different type of selection concern. And in a similar way, though, at the other side of the life cycle, to the extent that transfers affect fertility, if we want to look at second generation effects, so the children born to former beneficiaries, if they are born at different points in time or to different types of women because of the changes in fertility, then the groups are also no longer comparable. No. So clearly this is not a question of finding missing data or figuring out, anticipating to avoid this happening, because this is the real life behavior that as a researcher, I just have to think about how can I handle this. And so at the very minimum, what I'm going to need is clarity on assumptions and good diagnostics to think about, okay, the selection that is there and the magnitude of the selection, to what extent can I take that into account through attrition selection corrections? Okay, so that's the attrition part. Moving on to other complications is what we can actually learn from in terms of what we can identify, causally identify on the long term. And so here there is kind of a concern that is a bit kind of that I think actually a concern that in the next 10 years will be less of a concern, but it's good to be aware. The first generation randomized control trials, including the ones on the cash transfers, very often were phase-in designs, meaning there was a treatment group that started at a certain moment, and a control group that started a little bit later, maybe a year later, 2 years later. On the short term, that was perfect. They could estimate, for instance, the 2-year impacts of the program before the control group was phased in. Of course, on the long term, it means that, imagine a program for a moment that has been going on ever since. Those differences between the two groups have become much smaller, because let's say the case of Progressa, after 20 years, you would have 20 years compared to 18 years and a half. And so you have almost the same exposure in the two groups. At best, what that means is we can estimate differential impacts on the long run, not the absolute impacts, right? So we can estimate the differential between the 18 months earlier exposure. And so we're going to need to make assumptions about how that differential impact then relates to the absolute impact. It also means that we often have much more limited statistical power, because clearly once you have this phase in and over a long period of time, that the differential is going to be less power than kind of the absolute difference that you had after 1 or 2 years. Now, one thing you can do, and I'll show this in the examples, is to say, okay, I know this, but I also remember Heckman, and there are certain sensitive ages that children may be more affected if they happen to start receiving the transfers at those point in time. And so can I kind of use that to gain power and focus my long-term evaluation on children that were randomly exposed or not during sensitive ages or a little bit later? And so we'll show examples of that. No, so you see kind of, so despite talking about experimental evaluations, we are in the world of needing to make assumptions and thinking about, exactly how we're going to address this thing. Of course, this concern is also there, and arguably even bigger, for non-experimental estimates. So let's take a diff or a regression discontinuity, because in almost all cases, if programs run over a long period of time, the eligibility criteria get updated over time. They should be in a certain way, and or the parallel trend assumption that may have seemed reasonable on the short term becomes less reasonable on the long term, and so and complicating further things that may not all be very well documented. Definitely, like eligibility criteria change, or you may know that they change, but you don't know how it affected the control group, etc. And so you're still in that world of estimating differentials, except for that you don't exactly know what differential you're estimating. And so all of this means that, so if we don't know what the differential we're estimating, we basically don't know what we're estimating, right? So we're not knowing what is the effect we're identifying. And so we really need to think this through from the beginnings, like what am I actually going to learn from a specific comparison, and what are the assumptions I need to make that conclusion. So for instance, in some cases, I can make a credible argument that the differential is going to be an underestimate of the absolute, but I need to think that through, kind of what are the assumptions I need for that to be true. Then the third challenge is what we can measure in terms of what we should be measuring, and what are the trade-offs between different methods, right? So the theory of change is very complex. So in an ideal world, I want to measure a lot of things. I already told you my ideal world is to observe all these individuals at every point in time over a 20-year period. Now that I can't do. The wide range through which human capital, but the same thing is true for productive investments, can affect individuals and households means that potentially there's a lot of different channels I want to measure, but that of course raises concerns with multiple hypothesis testing, so I'm going to need to correct for that. But in addition to that, a lot of the outcomes I'm interested in, I actually need to wait long enough. And if I don't wait long enough, I may run into troubles. So why is that? Is because if let's say I'm thinking of the human capital returns to the conditional cash transfer programs received during schooling ages, and I go back 10 years later when children are typically in young adulthood. At that point in time, they're very much transitioning between many different things. They may be transitioning between education and income, and the labor market. They may be forming families or not yet. Some of them will, some of them won't. Some of them may have started fertility, some of them won't. And all of the timing of these things can be affected by the transfers. And so if I observe them during that transition period, the outcomes are not necessarily very informative about the long-term returns. In particular, the very obvious case is that if programs induce people to get more education and potentially to continue, for instance, to a higher level of education, so let's say to go to tertiary, when I observe them when they're 20, the treatment group may still be in school, while the control group may have started working, or at least a higher percentage may have started working. And so seeing higher incomes of the control at that point in time, you may conclude that the program didn't have returns. In fact, it seems to have negative returns. While in fact it does, it's just that the kind of the treatment group is still getting more education to eventually have higher income. And that's true for all of these different kind of trajectory kind of questions. And so it's kind of really hard at that point. You can say, I'm aware of this, I can observe this and take this into account, But as a result, you won't know, because it could be that for some of these individuals, the returns to tertiary education is not actually very high, and that the ones that started earlier working also on the long term will have better impacts and so higher impacts. And so in a certain way, the only answer to that really is to wait long enough. But of course, we're all impatient. And it doesn't mean we can't learn anything in the process, but we need to be aware of this problem. So one thing we can do is to think, given that we know that there's going to be a bunch of outcomes that are censored at any given point in time, is to make sure we define our variables in such a way that at least they make sense for the snapshot point in which I'm observing them. So for instance, if you think about fertility, I may define variables as saying having become pregnant at the age of, let's say, 16, 17, 18, etc., because that is defined for everybody that I observe, and that means something or not, but I guess that's up to you, given the context and given the question you're studying. And so that's kind of one way around this on at least on the temporary basis. An additional complication for the productive investments is that these typically are given investments at the household level, but household composition changes over time. And so 20 years later, that same household doesn't exist anymore. And so which individuals do I follow? What do I consider my household 20 years later? Raise this question, because of course the returns to certain investments may be with one of the original members, and you don't necessarily know in advance who that would be. Okay, so how do we solve these problems? I'm going to focus on the attrition problems for a second. I already hinted this. So some of the solutions in the literature is kind of saying, I'm going to use administrative data that by design allow to track everybody. Okay. The obvious case is census data. So in countries where we have individual census data that can be used and linked back to original treatment assignment, that potentially provides an opportunity to look at long-term impacts. School records or test scores are another example where that has been used in the literature. And in fact, it's kind of that example. There's an example in Colombia that of two papers that use basically the same strategy with the high school graduation records in Colombia, showing that depending on when you do this exercise, you may get very different results, exactly because school progression can be affected by the intervention. So if you do the high school exams scores and you do it relatively early on, not everybody has reached because of great repetition, etc., has reached the end of high school, and so you get very different conclusions. You still need to match people back to their initial treatment status, and that is, I already mentioned that, how we do that, either national identifiers, or if you had geographical targeting, and if you have in the data the place of birth, you can do that. Of course, that still leaves, if it's a census, still leaves international migration out, still leaves this issue of mortality and fertility, etc. Now, the other constraint, of course, with administrative data is at that point, the data you have is what is the outcomes you have is what is in the data, and you're limited to that. So I'm going to give the example of Honduras to kind of document kind of these trade-offs. So this is in work with Teresa Molina Milan, with John and Luis Tejerina, where there is a program that was started in 2000, where this is actually the exception in a certain way, one of the early CCTs where the control group never got phased in. And so we can look at the absolute impact 13 years later. Why 13 years later? Is because there's this population census in 2013 that asks people questions about their place of birth. So we can map them to where they were when the program was started. And why can we do that is because the randomization was at a relatively large geographical area at the municipality level. Okay? The trade-off that comes with is that there's only so many municipalities or poor municipalities that were targeted, and so we have a relatively limited number of treatment and control units. So there's going to be concerns with power, also potentially with accidental imbalances that one needs to address or can address through randomization inference. Though the nice thing about the census is you have a lot of kids, right? And you have kids of all the ages, Now, why is that a nice thing? Is apart from the fact that, the obvious point of power is that you can also look at rare outcomes such as early teenage pregnancies, migration, university level education, at least in Honduras, that was rare for this population. And so because you in each of those, even if the percentage of people with each in the for these outcomes with positive indicators for those outcomes is maybe low, because you have the census, you have enough people to look at. The limits is that censuses don't have, many censuses don't have income, they don't have job characteristics, they definitely don't have measures of cognition, of learning, etc. So you kind of limited in kind of what you learn about the pathways. I'm gonna and the other thing and that's kind of by the nature of it being a snapshot, we get all these cohorts, we can observe them, but we don't quite know how to compare them, because we can observe, for instance, education of people that got, and this is exactly, that's actually the next slide, that's what we do here. So, we have, the program took 5 years. Depending on the age at the start of the program, you may have different exposure to the health components, which are targeting early childhood, or the education components, which targeted kids in school. The ages 13 years later vary a lot. And so, for instance, the 13 to 15-year-olds will have gotten a lot of exposure to the health parts of the program. The kids that are 19 to 23 in 2013 got a big of exposure to education. But of course, we can't really compare those two impacts, because those are different cohorts that may be different for other reasons. So we can estimate the impacts, but the comparison remains, needs additional assumption. Now, one thing that is nice about this design is that one can look at this group here, which is kind of interesting. So this is the group that was not born, not even by the end of the program. And so they got no direct exposure, we know. So if we see differences between the treatment and the control among those children, when they're 6 to 8, we kind of know that that must be because of these changes in behavior among the households that were initially targeted, or the communities that were targeted by the intervention, because these kids never were directly exposed. And similarly, we can look at spillovers on older cohorts. So I'm going to skip over what no, I'm gonna, so what we find, because it's gonna coincide with the first bullet, with the summary of the results afterwards. But let me give you the migration results, because it speaks to this complexity of migration. So what we find, in fact, in Honduras is that if you look at domestic migration, the people in the control, the kids in the control, or the young adults now, are more likely to still be in their municipalities of origin. So there's the control. So there's a negative impact on migration for the cohorts that benefited from the program. However, if you look at international migration, which in Honduras we can do, because the households are being asked about their former members that now are typically in the US, or elsewhere, migrated internationally. And we see that among men, at least, there is a positive impact on international migration. And so you get this non-linear effect. And so if you didn't have this type of data, if you would kind of just have you go back to the original communities, you may not see that de facto there is two kind of countervailing things that are canceling each other out. And so you kind of you would miss in a certain way the fact that these two groups are really not comparable anymore. Those with a propensity to migrate internationally are no longer there, and more people stayed behind. It also shows you that kind of making assumptions about migration is difficult, because I motivated this by saying we expect people to move out of rural areas into urban areas, because that's where returns to human capital are higher. Well, we see here in Honduras, that's not actually what they did. Potentially they're in the cities, in those municipalities, that we don't know, but they're not, it's not the selection that we would have anticipated. And typically, just to say a word on that, because we'll see the same in Mexico, typically that if you think about that, partly that's related to this point that I made about, in the meantime, lots of other people in Honduras are getting a higher education for other reasons, not the cash transfers. And so the rural poor individuals may not necessarily have a competitive advantage kind of moving to Tegucigalpa or other cities. The other thing we can do, so that's an example with census data. So going to a different case study is we can try to find people. So we can say, okay, I'm going to do primary data collection, but I'm going to design my primary data collection in such a way that I'm focused on trying to get information about everybody from the original samples. I'm going to need to use different methods for that. I'll come back to that and start from good diagnostic of why people, which ones are the people that are gone, why are they gone, and what does this tell me about how do I try to find them. Of course, in this case, because you start from the original sample, the matching is automatic, so that problem is solved, as opposed to with the administrative data, but you're never going to find everybody. And so you're still going to need to make assumptions about, okay, how do we, of those that I didn't find in the end, what do I do with them? Now, there's going to be trade-offs also in terms of outcomes coming to the other challenges. Now, in theory, if I go survey people, I can ask them lots of questions once I have them. But if I want to kind of have a strategy that says, okay, I want to not, if I don't find the individual, maybe I find the parents, the original beneficiaries, and can ask them questions, I can do that. I can work with proxy respondents, but they won't know the details about some of the more detailed outcomes. Or for instance, I can't do a cognitive test with the model because if I want to know the cognition of the child. I can do phone service, but that often helps to find people. It also, in some cases, people trust it more, in other places people trust it less. Obviously, some places you have selective coverage. Again, you kind of need to think it through. And then finally, finding people is actually really hard. And so if you put emphasis on finding people because you're worried about selection, you may, in fact, not want to have this very large survey because the bandwidth of the field team then will be kind of spread between kind of getting all the outcomes and getting and finding the people. So two examples here. One of them is in Nicaragua, but you have the slides and you had to. I'm gonna in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip over it for now, so that we have enough time for questions, but happy to come back to that in the questions to this. And so go to the example of Mexico, and why do I do that is because this is to date kind of the case where we've been able to follow for the longest period of time. 20 years, and also because Mexico, as I said, was kind of the original conditional cash transfer program. So for those of you who don't know Progressa, very quickly, this was a conditional cash transfer program given to mothers, relatively large number of large amounts, conditional on taking young children to health checks, older children had to go to school, and there was some information about nutrition and health type of thing. The program was scaled nationally, much by own, changed names a few times. The initial experimentation was on a large set of villages, 506, 2/3 of which started transfers in May 98, 1/3 started 18 months later. Okay? A very large literature with the surveys that were collected on the short term about the short-term impacts on this. It was very well powered for short-term impacts. So a lot of what we know about conditional cash transfer programs in certain way you initially know because of the Progressa data. There was very large take-up, so we don't have to worry about that. And then we also know that a lot of people stayed into this program for a very long period of time. Okay? And so we have this problem that I described where if you want to go back, so we tried to go back 20 years later, or we did go back 20 years later, we had this problem saying, okay, 20 years later, I'm comparing 8.5 months of years of exposure to 20 years of exposure. So what can I really learn from that differential? So how did we solve this problem? Sorry, and this is joint work with Carila Raucho, who's at the IDB. How do we solve this problem? Well, what we did is we say, okay, there's two groups among those kids for whom, building on, again, thinking of the Heckman kind of critical ages idea, for whom that timing of 18 months, we should expect to still make a difference 20 years later. Who are those two cohorts? Well, the first ones are those that were exposed to neutral or very early in life. And why is that? Is because nutrition and medical science tells us that nutrition, preventive health, exposure very early on in life, the first 1,000 days, makes a big difference for brain development and cognition, and therefore kind of later life outcomes and health outcomes. And so having been exposed 18 months later, i.e. more likely out of the 1,000 windows, we expect to still make a difference on the long term. So those 20 years later are about 18 to 20 years old. So they're exactly in that age group that they described as being somewhat problematic because they're in between outcomes, but we can look at their education outcomes at that point. The other cohort is going to be the cohort that was at the transition from primary to secondary school at the beginning of the program. The short-term evidence had shown that this is the cohort for whom the short-term impacts were the biggest. So this is not necessarily, of course, we understand it's exposed, but it's also based on the empirical findings. And so we knew from the short-term and the medium-term results that if you were in that transition, 18 months later, you were more likely to have dropped out of school. Well, if you in 98, you were at the transition, you kind of continue to secondary school. And the short-term results had actually shown that you had more likely to finish lower secondary school. So you may have more learning, you may have a higher education level. You also know we're more likely to have gone to school outside of your village because lower secondary school at that time was outside of the village, at least in 80% of the villages. And because you went to school outside of the village, you were exposed to different networks. Now, this is kind of an interesting group because in 2017, when we tried to find them back, they were about 30 years old. And so they were at the stage where kind of they had transitioned, their transition into adulthood was complete, and we can really understand kind of returns for them. Now, how do we do this? How do we find these people was the big question 20 years later. So what we did is we first did what I described as you would do for kind of most studies, you go back to the original villages. But so we did that, and so we did this just to kind of flag that on purpose, kind of as the program was reaching its 20th anniversary. So we go back to the original villages, but rather than just kind of surveying those that were there and leaving, the whole focus was about saying, okay, what information exists in the original villages about these young people that probably have left, and some of them may still be there. So we go to the villages, we figure out who's still there. If they were there, we interviewed them. If they were not there, we talk to their mothers or somebody from the original family to understand where they may be. We did this, 20 years later, you show up, you have to explain, you have to buy, this is Mexico in 20 years had changed a lot. So there is kind of issues with gaining trust, with kind of developing a strategy that makes people willing to provide information about migrants, including illegal migration or irregular migration in the US. We needed, contact information, etc. And so we do a whole kind of an approach that is very much focused on finding people. Okay, we have obviously, if we find them, we do a survey, but a very short survey. Why? Also because we wanted to be able to do the survey by phone. And again, we didn't want to scare people off. We wanted to find them. Once we have all that information, we then have an intensive tracking phase. So then again, we develop a strategy to go find people everywhere in Mexico or to kind of reach them if they were in the US and using migration networks, etc. So did this work? And so the answer is kind of remarkably so in a certain way. Why do I say that? Is the 10-year follow-up of the same program for the cohorts of interest had attrition rates up to 60%. So with an attrition rate of 60%, you're in this world where I said the few people that left, they're not particularly interesting in terms of understanding the returns to human capital. With these different strategies, we find back 93%, information on 93%, half of them that we managed to, that we surveyed face by face, but also a big part that were interviewed by phone. We can walk through the details, but in the interest of time, let me just show you some kind of what's going on here. This is where those kids were, or the households were in 1997. Mexico City is here, so it's 7 kind of rural, so 7 states, the rural areas of those states, the poorer areas around Mexico City. So this is that same area that I was showing you, it's over here. So where are people, kind of zooming in, not surprisingly, many of them moved to Mexico City, so to the big cities. They also moved to the kind of the other big cities in Mexico, Guadalajara, Monterrey, etc. But more interestingly, they're really all over the place. They're in 31 of the 32 states in Mexico, and they're all over the US. Indeed, there's one in Canada over here. And so the mobility here is kind of clearly an interesting and an important part of the story. And as I was hinting at, only 1/3 are still in the locality of origin. So surveying at the locality of origin would have given you only a picture of the minority of people, and presumably those that may have the lowest return to their human capital, if you believe that that's those that stay behind. Even among the younger cohorts, so the kids that were 20, when we resurveyed them, half of them are already no longer in the locality of origin. We can go through the details, but in the interest of time, let me just show you some of the key results. This is the younger cohort, okay? And this is education, so years of education. And so being exposed 18 months earlier, at the very early years of life, means that 20 years later, across all levels of education, the treatment group had higher levels of education. So this is up to 6th grades is primary, second. So of course here most of this cohort has primary, so the impacts are big, but there is more likelihood to finish lower secondary school, higher secondary school, and even university. And so by the age they're 20, some of the 23% is still in school, so this was not finished, it's still censored, but at least we already know that at least they got this much, right? So that's the idea of the censoring. Of course, these are too young to get, because of the transition thing, to get income, but we ask income expectations, which is a different way of getting around this issue. That's of course noisy data, but the noisy data does show that those individuals expect higher income consistent with their higher education. What about the school cohort? And so this is actually kind of a contrasting view, because the school cohort, the long-term results confirm that they got more likely to be getting lower secondary education. The probability of graduating from lower secondary education is substantially higher, but then there's not much happening afterwards. Which kind of makes sense, because the people that you had an impact, like they were on the margin of dropping out between primary and secondary school, the program basically pushed them one level up, but then eventually, of course, they drop out. Does that help those kids? Because no, so what we're identifying now is getting lower secondary school, a higher probability, about 8% higher probability of getting lower secondary school. Does that make a difference? And so, interestingly enough, so this is the top is everybody, the bottom is just the girls. There's not a higher probability of having labor income, but which makes it easier to interpret then the impacts on income itself. And so we see a 16 to 18% increase in income, partly because they have US income. So again, migration being a really important part of the story here. I'm going to skip through this happy to come back to it, but in terms of the last point on marriage, so kind of it's not just labor market returns we're interested in when studying long-term returns. There's clearly other aspects of life, and marriage and fertility is an obvious one, and in this case also a shift again across the board in the age of having a first child. True for this is the woman's graph, but it's also true for men. So importance of geographic mobility to understand the returns to human capital. Now, you could say this is a Mexico-specific story because of the border with the US. Now, arguably, I would argue that's not clear, because labor market frictions exist everywhere. So the reason why they go to the US is because of labor market frictions, potentially in Mexico. Partly that, because there are much higher returns in the US. But the labor market frictions exist everywhere. And what we also see, I skipped over that, is those that don't go to the US. In fact, they go to different types of places in Mexico. Also suggesting that, again, the pathway can be complex, and only by following people can we understand that. And the childhood one I said. Okay, going to the global evidence before going to the questions. This table shows, this is a rework table from the chapter that you read, shows what we know of where we have evidence. It doesn't show what we know, it shows where we have evidence. So follow-ups that happened 5 to 10 years later, 11 to 15 years later, or 16 to 20, for children that were exposed in early childhood. So the health part of this is conditional cash transfer programs, the health part of the interventions, the education parts of the cash transfer programs, and the young adults, which are also exposed to the education in some countries. And so you see that almost all of the evidence comes from arguably the medium term, 5 to 10 years. A lot in Latin America because that's where the program started, but an increasing number in Africa and South Asia and Southeast Asia. Once we go to the more than 10 years, the evidence is limited to Honduras and Mexico, and the 20 years to the study that I just showed. And so the reason I'm showing this is that in a certain way, that kind of going back to what I was saying in the beginning, there's a lot of things we don't know yet of the true long-term return, and hence kind of a lot of room for further work on this. What we do see in all of where we have evidence is that strong evidence that cash transfers lead to higher education attainment, higher levels of schooling, the typically higher levels of schooling that go way beyond the conditions that were imposed, because typically the conditions are on a selected set of grades. The impacts are at higher levels. So let's say the CCT was only on primary school, but the impacts are also at secondary school or even university. And we see those both for the children exposed during school-going ages, but also those exposed in early childhood. More mixed evidence on cognitive gains or on learning outcomes, even within the same country, and hinted at this in Colombia. And then positive, where we have evidence on the labor market outcomes, we find positive impacts, but again, it's only 2 countries where we have that type of evidence for the 13 to 20 year period. In terms of the unconditional cash transfers and what we know on the productive investments, here so it's kind of shifting gears a little bit, but going back to what we were talking about earlier, is there's an interesting pattern, and I think really a question for research, is that we see asset accumulation during interventions. We see that both in Mexico and Zambia, for instance, where that has been documented. I think there's a lot of upcoming evidence that points in the same direction. Though it wasn't the case in Indonesia. Again, there's an interesting question of why it's different in Indonesia. But also what we see is that why we see asset accumulation, so households have more livestock or potentially land or whatever it is that they buy with the cash transfers. Once the transfers end and we go back for long, medium-term follow-ups, it seems like those gains are not persisted, at least in the countries where we were able to do that. And so that's kind of a puzzling question, because the whole kind of logic in a certain way of the investments in physical assets would be that they have kind of longer term returns. If we don't see them, that raises question. Of course, I don't expect that result to be universally true, and there must be heterogeneity in that, but there is kind of that's exactly in terms of the questions, kind of when do these type of impacts fade and when not. We see very limited long-term impacts of lump sum transfers where it exists, but most of those are relatively small cash transfers that we have. And so again, an open question on whether that's just not enough to overcome the type of poverty gap that Oriana talked about. And so overall, I think a lot more. The reason I'm talking about this less is that we just know very much less about this, and some room for more work. So with that, let's kind of flagging some open research questions. I already said definitely more work to be done on UCTs, more work to be done outside of Latin America. Questions about, okay, what can we learn from the long term about the questions that you thought about last week on the program design? So do we know that over time we will be in a world where we can go back on the long term to some of the programs that varied the program features, and so that tells us, to what extent are we going to learn different answers from kind of the long term than the short term answers. There's a different question, but an important one and a hard one to tackle, which is that if you have programs that go on for 20 years, like Progressa did, do they lose effectiveness over time? Right? So one thing is all our impact results typically are from the first year of interventions. Right? So that's kind of when governments are interested in the impact evaluations. But possibly once you kind of programs go on for a very long period of time, they lose effectiveness because people get used to them, or because of some other reaction, a behavioral reaction that happens. And a related question, but arguably an even more difficult one, is to say, well, today I can tell you about the long-term impacts of Progressa as it was in 1997, but what I want to know as a policymaker is the long-term impact of a program I could do today 30 years down the line. But, but 30 years down the line, I don't know what the world will look at. And so I don't necessarily know how to think about the returns in that way. It's just picking up on a few points here. There's definitely room for more work on non-labor market outcomes. I hinted at this a little bit. Flowing from mental health, aspirations, stress, networks, you name it, and how those then potentially link to the more economic returns. And these questions of community-wide effects that we hinted at earlier. And then finally, the obvious one is, as more time still passes, one would be able to look at the impacts on the next generation. So to finish, I'm kind of what have we learned, I think, from this literature to date, even if there's much more to learn, is that where we look, we see returns to cash transfers, at the very least on levels of education, but we also see returns on the health and nutrition interventions, kind of translating into human capital on the longer term. So that's good news. But we also see across the board, where we've been able to look at it that way, is that people that to observe those gains, you need to account for the fact that young people move. They will go find opportunities. And that's the good news. It's like it looks like people are able to go find the returns to their human capital, even in context where labor market frictions exist. We also saw these multiplier effects through the productive investments of transfers. That's, again, relatively good news. That means that they have bigger impacts than the amounts that are being spent. But this kind of question about asset fading out potentially because physical assets can deplete, human capital less so. And then the conditionalities can help shift investment to human capital. It doesn't necessarily have to be the hard conditionality. On the short term, we've learned that. On the long term, what we learned from this literature is that these effects on non-targeted children and potentially non-targeted kind of cohorts suggest kind of the shifts in behavior are kind of part of the story. And so we're gonna stop over there, open it for questions, but just kind of re-emphasizing that there's a much more work to be done here, and so hoping that this was useful. So some of you are thinking in this space. And so Lorena, I'll start with you. Or we start with you, and then so I'll ask you your question, and then we'll turn to John to see whether we should come back to anything in the go ahead.
Thank you. No, thank you for this very interesting lecture. And my question is, well, I have an early stage research project on trying to measure or estimating the intergenerational effects of the cash transfer in Ecuador, the Bono de Desarrollo Humano. And my approach currently compares parents' outcomes during their adulthood, when they were receiving their cash transfer, and their children's outcomes when they reach adulthood. I do have admin records. So, but I'm thinking if this design can help us answer questions about the consumption investment trade-offs that parents face when receiving this additional monthly income, in the sense of like, do parents use the transfer for like immediate consumption or increasing their income or increasing their outcomes, let's say, compared to those that are more related to investing in their children's human capital towards, let's say, increasing budget for transportation or the materials that might be needed for, assisting in a good way schools, or having everything that they might need, right? This is an unconditional cash transfer. And on a technical note, I just wanted to know if there is a rigorous, empirical way to try to account for the fact that we are estimating differential effects.
Okay, so for the differential effects, I think I don't think this is a question of empirics. It's really a question of thinking through, for your particular setting, what is it that you're measuring? Like, what is the differential effect, and what do you know? And I think for Ecuador, this is actually a very relevant question. What do you know happened to the treatment assignment over time, right? So, kind of, if families were able to move in and out. Once you look at the long-term results, you need to know to what extent people were moving in and out of the program. I'm not sure you're able to track that, but I guess that would be the first thing to see, whether you can use the administrative data to not just track the beneficiaries, but also to see whether the control or what was the control over time may have made it into the treatment, because then kind of that will tell you what exactly is the differential you're estimating, right? And so that, I mean, so that would go, you know, so it's great you ask this question, because that kind of means that you need to work with the, you know, with the like seeing what you can get your hands on in terms of the administrative data to trace the trajectories that are there for these different individuals. John, you want to complement anything?
No, not on that, but I'm happy to raise some of the other questions if you're finished.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So there were a handful of questions around the extent to which these types of programs are possible in rapidly changing contexts or in more corrupt contexts. I don't know, Karen, maybe you have more insight into examples of those and what you think some of the pitfalls of a CCT or UCT type approach in those contexts might be.
So the question is on the effectiveness of the program, not of the long-term impacts.
Yes, more on the effectiveness. Are they useful programs in those areas?
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. No, I think this is a fantastic question. It's one I've been thinking about in the context of Madagascar the last year or so, where I've been doing a lot of work, and that is a good example of you know, low state capacity country with that is a context very different than, you know, Mexico in 1997. So it's a good question, and so this is we need more research on those settings, and we need to think about, okay, what is it in these contexts that will that could be more challenging. So for instance, the literature comparing the UCTs from the with the CCTs kind of and the literature kind of suggests that the social marketing around it kind of, or the soft conditionalities, the messaging around the types of investments to do matters. In low state capacity settings, getting that messages across may be harder. Implementation fidelity can be weaker. And so money may also not arrive, and therefore the trust and the confidence in the system that you need for, you know, households to keep their children in school if it's the conditions may be more difficult. And so I think that's kind of, for the short term, that's kind of what you it's kind of that's really the kind of the interest, the kind of the research agenda there is saying, okay, what are the to use these the kind of the conditional programs in different, in more challenging contexts, or indeed in conflict type of settings, what could go wrong compared to what we know how they work in, or how they worked in middle income Latin America or in middle income Indonesia, and can we think of solutions to that, alternatives? And so I'll give you one example that in fact we wanted to test in Madagascar. Let's see whether we can still do it. Is the government, the Ministry of Education, is convinced that, no, sorry, that's not true. There's an open question. It's not that they're convinced. There's an open question on whether it's better to give the money to the parents or to the schools. And you can argue this theoretically in many different ways, but ultimately it's going to be an empirical question, right? And so that's kind of an example where you can kind of think through the trade-offs, you know, for the evidence for Mexico in 1997 showed that, you know, showing giving the money to the parents was the right thing to do. Whether that's the right thing to do in Madagascar, given that, again, the money may not arrive, not everybody has mobile bank accounts, blah, 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 is a different type of question. So, and so I think going back to kind of the focus of the lecture is kind of what we have reasons to believe, and I think that's important, is that on the long term, there is kind of the evidence we have to date shows substantial returns to these type of programs. For the unconditional cash transfer, there is more open questions, just also by nature because they started later. But we do know that kind of that's kind of the part I went through in the end, that even the soft conditionalities make a difference. And so that, I think that's an example of a question you could say, well, you know, imposing the hard conditionalities may be really hard in a low state capacity environment, or in a capacity in a context where you have conflict, etc. But maybe we can figure out a way around the messaging, because maybe there's mobile phone services that works, etc. And so kind of having the kind of the soft conditionality around it may be sufficient And so I think that's kind of how you think about it. How do we get around the constraints, and which parts can we do, or do we need to adapt kind of given the setting?
Great, thanks. Maybe I'll take on and you can complement Karen after another area of questions, which was around the size of the transfers. So what sizes would be recommended, if you will. So across the different countries that implemented CCTs in Latin America, there's certainly a range. The Honduras case that Karen was describing was actually a relatively small transfer, about 4% of average pre-program income in the areas. In Mexico, it was sort of closer to 10%, if I'm not mistaken. And in Nicaragua, it was closer to 15 to 18% of pre-program expenditures. So this variation in the size of transfers is certainly going to be linked to the impact of those programs. Again, it's going to be a bit of an empirical question as to what size is most appropriate in different contexts. But some of the ways that one can go about calculating these has to do with, for example, thinking through the opportunity costs of schooling, if that's the key objective for different age groups in the country. Just one more piece that's relevant here is in Mexico, what was done, recognizing that as children aged, as they went through the schooling system, the opportunity cost of their time was higher. The transfers actually grew as children, they were larger for children in higher grades. Moreover, they were higher for girls compared to boys in an effort to address some imbalances in educational achievement between the sexes prior to the program. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Karen. If not, we can go to some of the online questions.
Yeah, so there's a few more hands up. So Amelia?
Hi, thank you, Dr. McCord. I'm curious, are there studies that suggest there are ways to structure social protection programming that support long-term domestic economic growth? For example, if the conditional cash transfers are tied to things like home ownership or business ownership in the country, are there any policy, any findings in that area? And then on a similar note, when considering the case of Mexico and the findings around migration, is there research that suggests that proximity or lack of proximity to a higher income country would encourage different local or international migration outcomes? Thank you.
So on the first, it's a great question. We don't have evidence of that as far as I'm aware. But John, you can think of something?
No.
On the migration question, again, it's a very good question. You know, the levels of migration in so many parts of the world are now, you know, it doesn't seem like distance is the binding constraint in many different places. And so that's also where I kind of, you know, of course, it is in some cases, right? Again, I'm working in Madagascar. Migrating from Madagascar for a poor rural individual obviously is very hard, given they're on an island in the Indian Pacific, but in the Indian Ocean. But I think in general, we've kind of seen international migration from many different places. So my intuition there, like again, we don't have good evidence on that, on the differences, but my intuition is that distance is not a binding constraint. Sorry, Shadwa.
Yeah, thank you so much for a very informative presentation. I was wondering about also the effectiveness of the transfer in terms of the stable real value of the transfer itself. So in cases where inflation rates are very high over periods 5 to 10 years, so this will shorten the effectiveness of the duration of the impact of the transfer itself, which will then may deviate the behavior of the treatment group from, let's say, investment in education to smoothing consumption. So then you will adjust methodologically, you will adjust towards the GDP deflators or the price indices available nationally. However, nationally, geographically, you might find also inflation rates are different between urban and rural areas. So then what do you recommend are the best price deflators and cost of living adjustments that we need to do that are appropriate for measuring such kind of inflation aspects in order to be able to pinpoint the real treatment intensity over time? Thank you so much.
Great question. John, you want to start? You're on mute.
I was trying to address other questions in the chat.
Sorry.
You want to...
Okay, so this is a great question. So and a hard one, right? So there's two parts, I think, in your question. One is that, what is the optimal design in context with high inflation rates? And so that kind of suggests that anything more frequent is gonna, the more frequent the payments can be, the more useful they're going to be. And of course, again, with mobile, in context where mobile money is an option, we know it's this is one area where it's much easier to do now than it was 25 years ago in many parts of the world. Then how do we think of the kind of the inflation correction in terms of the cost benefit, which is really what this is, right? So we can measure. So why I'm saying that is because we can measure the impact of the intervention the way it was designed. Of course, if we see no impact, we need to worry about, well, maybe the amounts were too small to make a difference. But otherwise, we can kind of say, okay, this is the intervention, and in a certain way, the monetary value of the intervention is not the first order thing I'm worried about if I'm thinking of the impact. Now, I am worried about it if I think of the cost effectiveness, right? So if I want to kind of compare this now to some other intervention in terms of cost effectiveness, and so there, I think there is kind of the tricky thing that you point out, and I think it's an important one, is that once you kind of need to think through kind of returns over a long period of time, which you need to do in a certain way to get the cost effectiveness right for the long-term results, how do you then account for the fact that inflation and exchange rates will kind of intervene, exchange rates if you work international. And this relates a little bit to the point I was making on the fact that ultimately what we want to know now is the next 30 years, not the previous 30 years. And so that one we obviously can't predict. We don't know how these things are going to move. And so the way I would think of that question is to say, so there's a question on optimal design of the transfers, which is kind of, that's not exactly the long-term impact part. So there, other than the frequency and the political feasibility, as John was saying, from the literature, we don't have a necessarily a strong indicator that the relatives that points to a particularly relative size, and therefore also that this issue of inflation in terms of the size would be a first order thing. Then whether, and so as a result, in a certain way, that also suggests that this is, if we what we care about is impact, I don't have to be too worried about the deflated amounts, right? So the Honduras program, despite it being very small amounts of money, did have a substantial impact kind of 13 years later. So like, I'm not advocating for too slow amounts, but I'm kind of saying maybe we don't need to worry too much about it since it's outside of the control. I see where the other hands are gone. That's because we're out of time.
Yeah, I think we are pretty close to running out here. I think if you want, we can take one more question.
Sure. I think Amit has a question.
Thank you, Professor. Just one question from my side is on the increased focus on improvement of digital infrastructure across countries, and especially for delivery of social protection. So we see a trend of various governments investing in digital identity on basic infrastructure, and also taking a life cycle approach to social protection that allows for tracking of individuals and beneficiaries across schemes. Do you believe that this investment would make it easier for us to assess the long-term impact? And some of the challenges that you mentioned were around availability of data, the fact that it was difficult to trace the beneficiaries after some time period. But do you think that all this investment and all this attention that is being given to digitization of social sponsors is going to benefit when it comes to tracking the long-term impacts? Thank you.
Yeah. John, you want to take that or you want me to answer?
That was also a theme. Thanks, Amit. That was a theme that came up in the chat, that at least in some measure, one way in which some of those greater digital efforts and tracking of individuals within the social protection systems can help our understanding of the programs is going to be through reducing attrition. So that may make it easier in many contexts to follow people and understand where they are, assuming they stay linked to the governmental systems.
Yeah, and just to
Stop there.
complement, look at the Duflo Dupac Kramer paper on Ghana. That's not cash transfers; it's high school like tuition fee waivers, scholarships basically. And the reason to look at it is because that's a program that started a bit later than kind of the programs we're talking about here. And so they, in a context where mobile phones were already there, and so they anticipated this problem of tracking by making sure that they had mobile phone for everybody and kept updating them over time. And so the reason I'm mentioning it is because if you start now on a program that you want to evaluate long term, or you think that you may want to evaluate it long term, that's clearly the investment to do. And so going back to your question, if you are in a context where indeed this is already happening institutionally, even better. Of course, there is privacy type of issues that need to be sorted out in terms of the access to the phone numbers, etc. But yes, in theory, that will make this whole exercise much more feasible. And so the more we can anticipate and the more kind of indeed also the linking with the other social insurance type of data can be done, the more kind of this problem can be solved kind of from in advance, which is not, as any research design, doing it up front is always going to be much better than doing it ex post type of thing. Great. I think we're out of time. Sorry, I left a little bit not enough time for questions. Feel free to, our emails are there. Feel free to reach out to John or myself, particularly if you're kind of doing research in this area. Happy to further exchange on this, and wishing you all the best for the next of the course.
That's very kind. Thank you, Professors Macora and Maluccio, for your time. Everyone, please join us next time. We are excited to have Professor Banerjee, the Nobel Prize winner in Economics from 2019, with Dr. Vivi Alatas, teaching on identifying program beneficiaries. So we'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.